Okay. Once again, I do this little bounce to try to attract your attention. Nobody's responded yet, but I keep trying. You have to keep fishing, keep drawing in. So, as I've said 2 times already, if you're either stimulated and agree with these remarks, or if you don't, and you're provoked, and you'd like to have another opportunity to talk to me about it, well, send me an email and perhaps we can set up a time when we can get together. Okay, so let me begin. I have to take an inventory. How many people are from UP Economics in the room? You have to hold your hands up really high so I can see. I see only one, 2, 3. Okay, that's good news for me. And the good news, the good news is that I'm giving the same lecture tomorrow at the UP. So you don't have to come. But maybe you need a second try. Maybe you don't get it the first time, Pooch, and so you can come a second time. Well, I'm glad there just aren't all, UP graduate students here that might be disappointed. That's good. Excellent. I'm pleased to hear that. As usual, I'm an American. We're taught to advertise all the time. That's our style. And so here we go. So the key part of this lecture comes from work that I had been doing with Branko Milanovic and Peter Lindert, which is finally going to appear in the, where's it going? In Economic Journal. And also this paper on Latin American inequality, which is, it draws a lot on that work with those other 2 folks. So it uses a lot of that stuff. I also lean heavily on this paper that Peter Lindert and I wrote, when we were 3 years old. Well, I mean, when was it? It doesn't even say when it was. It was 1982. Where is it? It doesn't say. Written in 1982, which was a very long time ago. Also, these 2 pieces I'm going to use later in the lecture. This one, Land, Labor, and Globalization in the First Global Century, and then some work with Matt Higgins on inequality and Kuznets curves. So here are the questions, and for me, I've always been interested in inequality issues. Primarily, I'm interested in the social impact of economic events, so inequality is certainly one manifestation of it, but there are also other questions that seem to be tied up with the distribution of income and wealth. Like what? Well, we're going to spend a lot of time discussing how inequality should be measured. It's not going to be which statistic to use, an Atkinson index or a Gini coefficient, and I think that's just statistics. But rather, we're going to talk about the economic principles underlying the measurement, and that's what I mean by that statement. So how are we going to measure it? And it's going to matter, I think, it's going to matter for modern debate in political economy on what are the conditions that make things favorable for growth, and the role of politics and institutions. They're going to be tied up in inequality and how you measure it. What causes changes in inequality? Do you need an industrial revolution, a huge economic shock to change the distribution of income and wealth in a system? Well, I'm going to look at evidence prior to the Industrial Revolution, and we're going to see big changes in inequality, and we're going to conclude apparently you don't need an Industrial Revolution. Is inequality in poor pre-industrial economies, ancient economies, you'll see what I mean by ancient in a minute. It's going to include Rome in right about the birth of Christ. That's pretty ancient. And we're going to see whether the patterns of distribution are very different in those pre-industrial economies compared to today's pre-industrial economies, mostly those in Africa? Not much, as we're going to see. Have some parts of the world always been more unequal than others? Well, whenever economists run a regression on the determinants of inequality, they always have to put in dummy variables. And one of the dummy variables will be for Latin America. And Latin Americans will always have the black hats. And they will be more unequal no matter what, controlling for anything else. And the other dummy variable has to be East Asia. And East Asia is always egalitarian, controlling for everything else. Has that always been so? Have these characteristics been true back 200 years, 400 years, or more? So is it something deeply embedded in the cultures of these places that would account for what we observe today? Does inequality breed violence, civil war, discontent, political instability, and all that stuff? Does inequality, in fact, perhaps because of that, inhibit economic growth? A question surely you ought to ponder when trying to explain the poor performance of the Philippine economy over the past 25 years. It's underachievement. Is it related to high inequality? And if so, how is that? What is the causality? Does democracy breed equality? Well, apparently not necessarily. And certainly doesn't in the United States. Very unequal place. It wasn't 45, 50 years ago. It is now. So it's not clear that it does. And what will the future of inequality look like? In particular, what is it going to look like in the Philippines when it responds to demographic events, global events, and all the rest? So those are difficult questions that social scientists have been pondering ever since Adam Smith, and the answers are hard to extract. And they're hard to extract because we don't have very good evidence on the distribution of income and wealth when you go back before 1960 or 1970. Certainly true of the Philippines, but it's true of most third world economies. It's even true of a lot of European economies. So it's hard to make progress on this issue because income distribution never changes quickly overnight. It's a long-term event. It gets embedded in a social system and changes only slowly over time. So how are we going to make progress if we want to be empirical? And I'm an empiricist, so I got to present you some numbers. Well, one way to do it is to use what are called social tables. And I'm going to elaborate on that. And I think they work just great, though Ben Lagarde already said he's not going to trust any of the results that they're based on. Certainly not for Rome. But let me see if I can persuade you, that these social tables are very useful for exploring patterns across countries and changes over time in inequality. Well, I got interested in this with Peter Lindert when we got our first 3 observations when we were doing work in 1982. So you have to have a very long perspective when you're doing research, you see. So 3 observations is not sufficient, to say very much. You can say a lot about England, but you can't say much about anywhere else. I picked up the 4th observation when I was lecturing in Mexico City, and some scholars there pointed me at a bishop who had constructed social tables for Nueva España around about the 1790s. So that's 4 observations. And the 29th observation dropped on our laps from a state in the middle of Mexico, which today, according to census information, pretty much replicates Mexico as a whole. So it may, this particular state, which is documented, as you can see, for the middle of the 19th century, may be a fairly good indicator of what's happening in Mexico in general. So you see, it took us, 28 years, 29 years to collect 29 observations to write this paper and get it published in the Economic Journal. Young people in the room, I do not advise you try to get tenure and get a secure appointment at a Manila University or here at AIM by a long-term project like this. But when you get to be my age, you can do these things, and you're not concerned about tenure, about the security of your position. You're a full professor, and you can do whatever you want, and you can get away with it, and that's wonderful. It's worth achieving that. Although I hear the state of Wisconsin is going to take that away from me if the current governor gets his way. But he can't get me, I'm retired. Here are the recent additions to give you a sense of how far I'm going to drag you back into history. So we have, as it turns out, pretty good evidence for England in 1290. And then we get it again 500 years later. We've got it for Thailand just prior to the Great Depression, which is quite detailed, actually. We've got it for the Levant in the late 16th century, Meiji Japan at the start of the Industrial Revolution in the late 80s, Tuscany, 1427, an amazing database. Every single individual is in this database. It's extraordinary. So not only household heads, but individuals. Well documented on their income and earnings and all the rest. Kenya, the problem is we don't have enough colonies in the sample. So you have to report this as two observations. Kenya separated only by 15 years, 1914 and 1929. Got it for Chile recently. Very good data for Chile. And more. We got Portugal, we got the Cape Colonies. I just told you about this Mexico state. And ta-da! Peter Lindert and I are at it again, and we're reconstructing the Americas in 1774, just prior to the Revolution, and then 1800 after the Revolution to see whether anything happened to the distribution of income and wealth. And we're almost done with that. It's taken us longer than I'd like to admit. The Philippines is missing from the sample. And I'm guessing that it can be documented. The social tables I'm about to describe can be constructed for the Philippines back into the early 18th century. I'm guessing that that's true. But I'm not going to do it. One of you is going to do that. But we need this information. If we're going to understand, how persistent inequality is in the Philippines and understand what drives it and what influence it has on other things in the Philippine economy, you have to have a very long view of this. And so we need those observations. You need one in the 18th century under the Spanish rule. You need one when the Americans come in and take over. We need another just prior to the 1960s, and then one for now. We'd like to have those benchmarks to say something about and we don't have it. We have it for the end. We don't have it for any of the others. So here's an example, great example, right? I mean, the French Revolution, and here's what it looks like. The way you get the data is the way Karl Marx would have constructed the data. He identifies social classes from the very top with the landed elite down to the bottom with paupers, and estimates the average incomes in each of those categories. And if you're happy with this and ignore the distribution of income within each of these groups, and of course there are rich noblemen and poor noblemen, and there are paupers that are elderly and infirmed, and paupers that aren't, younger and have more strength, etc. So there's variance in incomes within each of these groups.